Welcome back, Anagenesis. Daniel here. Today, what we want to do is dive a little deeper into the principles of wise life management. And we're going to do this by focusing on a basic human issue. Here's the issue. The problem is that my moment-to-moment desires often do not correspond to what actually produces what is best for me and for those around me. In other words, what appears to me at first blush, on first glance, to be pleasant and good and holding the promise of life enhancement, often, in reality, leads down a path that ends up producing misery and ruin and even death. Now, that's the human issue. In Christian terms, we have language for this. We use the word temptation, it's just the word test is what it is, from a Latin word that means to test. And what that's about is that it's moments like this where we have an impulse, a desire towards one thing that doesn't lead to our ultimate well-being. It's in those moments that some of our true character is revealed. We find out as we face those moments if we're the sort of person who lives with the strength of long-sighted, reality-oriented wisdom, or if, at least so far, we've become the kind of person who impotently, weakly gets sucked into short-sighted and illusory desires that lead away from life. That's why that word test or temptation is used in Christian teaching. Now, we live in a world, and we might as well just acknowledge it, a world in which many have decided to kind of cast off the whole Christian moral code because the whole language of sin and temptation began to feel oppressive and stifling to them. And we can even acknowledge that, of course, there were some distortions of Christian teaching that made it that way. But what we also have to acknowledge, if we're going to live wisely, is that the underlying problem that this language and this moral code is addressing is not religious. It's human. It's there for every human being, no matter where you live, what religion you're a part of. Everybody has to deal with this same feature of human existence. I still, even if I get rid of Christian moral teachings, I still have to find some way to live in this world. And that means I have to calibrate my choices and my actions in this life in light of the fact that many of my immediate desires, if I indulge them, will ultimately destroy me. For instance, if I just indulge and gorge on sugar products all the time, as my desire would lead me to, it will result in obesity and diabetes and health problems and a myriad of other difficulties in life. If I indulge in just unrestrained sex whenever I feel like, wherever, what it will lead to is disease and social conflict, the destruction of myself and other persons, and typically violence follows from that kind of behavior because of the complications that inevitably arise in life. If I self-indulgently just lie around and kind of indulge my laziness instead of disciplining myself to work even when I don't want to, it will result in poverty, loss of social esteem, depression, etc. If I give vent to an explosive, violent, angry temper and don't bridle that, it will lead to the wreckage of every social relationship, the loss of welcome in society, and eventually, in all likelihood, to all sorts of personal harm, even death through the retaliation of other people. You see, those aren't just religious issues. Those are human issues that have to do with it's the nature of reality living in this world. We all have to find a way to deal with the fact that there's this mismatch between our immediate impulses, at least to start with, and what makes for long-term well-being and life in this world. So, if that's the human issue, are there principles available for managing the problem of misguided human desire? The answer is yes, and that's what Proverbs chapter 5 is really all about. And it offers to us four principles for learning to resist those immediate impulses, those short-sighted, destructive desires, so that we can instead walk down the path that leads to a life of flourishing and well-being for ourselves and others. It begins, the first 6 verses, by telling us that we can use the teachings that we find in Scripture and in the book of Proverbs in particular, use teachings in order to develop a kind of moral depth perception. Here's what it says. Give attention, my son, to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding, so that you may observe discretion and your lips may reserve knowledge. Because, and now notice here, you're going to see there's a surface, immediate appearance, and it's going to be contrasted with what's deeper in, the end result. And so this is where the depth perception comes in. Okay? Because the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. But in the end, after you walk down that path, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to Sheol. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways are unstable, and she does not even know it. So there's this mismatch between the immediate desire that one feels, and in this case, throughout chapter 5, what he's doing for us is he's taking sexual temptation or sexual desire as kind of the primary test case. The point of this is, first of all, it's a universal. Everybody has to deal with that. It's built into us at such a deep biological level. Everybody has that as a struggle. Second, what enables us to calibrate our response to that desire will likewise work in response to all the different desires that we're going to deal with in life. And so it's a test case, but this is not only about sex, this is about how we respond to the draw of desire that is towards something inappropriate, okay, in general. And so the first thing that we see here is that there's a need to use the teaching to separate out the surface appearance of that desire from the deep long-term result. So on the surface, it's smooth, it's sweet, it's pleasant. Everything starts off great, but what we have to do is learn to look past that to the long-term result, because down the road, the end is bitter and cutting and death-dealing. It ends poorly. And so what happens is we can use these teachings to develop that depth perception, to see where it's going and not get sucked in by the surface of the temptation. Now, let me tie this back into something that we did earlier. I think it was the 4th video, we talked about wisdom and the human heart, and we really zoomed in on or gave our attention to the nature of this faculty we have called the heart. Now, what we said there is that the heart has a capacity, kind of like your camera, to zoom in or zoom out, right? In other words, to be absorbed and kind of sucked in with all of its attention, all of its awareness into one thing. And that's what we experience when we are in the grip of a desire. But it also has this capacity to voluntarily zoom out, to broaden our awareness, and through that, to put in context the thing that we're desiring and make a choice based on all these other factors, based on reality. Now, the antidote to desire is that zoom out. It's instead of allowing ourselves to be absorbed by the surface that's presenting itself to us, what we do is we pull back and we intentionally take on a broader, more inclusive awareness. And so we think about moral teachings, we think about the end result that this has had in many other lives for those who've walked down that path. And we bring in more information within our awareness, and that broader understanding gives us the capacity to then choose rather than simply yield to whatever it is that we desire at the moment. And so that zooming out is what gives us this moral depth perception that's being described here in the first 6 verses. Okay, so that's the first thing. We develop moral depth perception, and we look at the end, not just at the beginning. We look at the depth, not just the surface of that desire that's tugging at us at the moment. Second principle, verses 7 through 14, we're basically told, get off the conveyor belt of desire, right? Get off the conveyor belt before you get to the crisis moment. Try to exit that process before the test fully grabs you and you are in the grip of what may be an overwhelming desire. And so he says this, now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. Now notice here, the focus is on the beginning, and on proximity, actually, on this is why we talk about the conveyor belt. You don't get in the flow of something that's going to carry you on with momentum into a place you don't want to be. And so he says this, keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your vigor to others and your years to the cruel one, lest strangers be filled with your strength and your hard-earned goods go to the house of an alien, and you groan at your latter end when your flesh and your body are consumed, and then you say, oh, how I hated instruction, and my heart spurned correction, reproof. And I did not listen to the voice of my teachers, nor did I incline my ear to my instructors. And so I was almost in ruin in the midst of the assembly and the congregation. Okay. Proximity matters. That's why the focus here is don't get near the door. Don't go in proximity to her. The principle, you could think about it this way. What I am aiming at in my life, if I'm living wisely, is not simply to avoid sin, to avoid succumbing to desire. My aim is to not enter into temptation, to avoid getting to the place where I'm so gripped by the desire that the struggle is overtaken and is all-consuming, whether or not I manage to resist at that moment. Okay? And just point out, this is Jesus' own advice in the garden to Peter, James, and John. You'll remember there's a crisis moment coming. There is a test that actually in their case they've asked to be involved in. And when he speaks to them in the garden and they're sleeping, he says, watch and pray. Why? Not so that you will not sin, but watch and pray so that you may not enter into temptation. Okay? These are words of wisdom. Okay? What wisdom does, the mark of wisdom, is that it does not overestimate its own willpower. It doesn't imagine that it has more strength and gumption for that moment than it really has. If you want to live wisely, assume this. Say, I am a human being. I have a breaking point. There is some degree of intensity of desire that I would succumb to. If I allow myself to get that close, I will fall. Now, I don't know exactly where that edge is in my life or yours. I don't know how much desire has to grip me before I will fall. But I know that there's some edge there that I am not infinitely full of moral strength. There is weakness within me. And so the wise thing for me to do is to assume there's a breaking point, and so look at life in terms of the events where one leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. There's this kind of conveyor belt that we get on, and it's like a series of sequential triggers. Now, what I want to do is, if this is the point at which I am gripped by a desire, okay, I need to think back several steps to what is it that gets me to the point that kind of draws me over there. And what I want to do is I want to avoid getting on the conveyor belt back here. Okay? I want to reverse engineer enough to not go to the place where there's a very real possibility that I will succumb and I will do something that will be destructive for myself and for others. Okay? So get off the conveyor belt of desire before it grips you. Third principle is in verses 15 to 20, intentionally, actively enjoy the goodness of God-given delights. Okay? This is so important. Verse 15 and following. 15 through 20. Drink water from your own cistern, fresh water from your own well. And this is metaphoric for speaking of the sexual encounter here. Okay? Drink water from your own cistern, fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be yours alone, and not for strangers along with you. Let your fountain be blessed. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a loving deer or a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated, intoxicated always with her love. For why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? So what he does here is kind of looking away from this desire that leads to death. He points out that God has so created us and put us together that the base desires always have kind of a healthy, God-given, appropriate direction and outlet. And in this case, it's marriage. And so the point of this is that joy is a very strong defense against temptation, against those shallow, easy, self-destructive desires. And the reason is that what sin does, what those shallow, self-destructive desires do, is they masquerade as a kind of neon happiness, as instant joy. This will fix all that you're concerned about right now. And so the best inoculation against the deceit of counterfeit happiness is to cultivate true joy. Real joy is the best vaccine against the against the disease of temptation and sin. Now, part of what is behind this is just that we have this very limited amount of energy for making our choices. And when I'm in a state of prolonged deprivation, that eats at my capacity, my energy for choice. And because of that, it will make me susceptible to temptation, vulnerable to these short-sighted, destructive desires. And so the best bulwark against misguided desire, is to actively, intentionally cultivate the good thing that God has made that corresponds to that desire. And in this case, that's marriage. And so he says, marry and then cultivate a healthy, vigorous, mutual enjoyment with your spouse. And you will find that gives you great strength against temptation. It makes it easier to not get on that conveyor belt that heads towards a place that could be collapse. Okay? So that's the third principle. Actively enjoy the goodness of God-given delights. And then fourth and last, verses 21 through 23, he basically says this: maintain an awareness of God's presence, of his attention of you in this life. Verses 21 through 23. For the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he watches all of his paths. His own iniquities will capture the wicked, and he'll be held with the cords of his sin. He will die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly, he will go astray. We're told here that the Lord is paying attention. And this is really important because secrecy is a part of the self-delusion that we engage in order to enable ourselves to take this short-sighted, self-destructive desire and act upon it. It's part of the moral psychology of sin that I have to, in order to do wrong that I know is wrong, I have to deceive myself. And part of what I do is I pretend that I'm unobserved, that nobody's watching, that I'm all alone. And that's one of the ways that I zoom in, right? I pretend I'm alone, and that allows me to be absorbed in that shallow, immediate desire. The antidote to that, as we said, is to zoom out. And one of the ways that we zoom out, a very, very powerful way to zoom out, is simply to notice God's presence. And let me say a word about the presence of God here. This is very important. Obviously, God's not present to me in this room in the form of a body. He's not near me in the same way that this book is in proximity to me. God's not a physical object, and so it's not space that makes him close or far away from something else. Persons, spiritual beings, are present to other spiritual beings through attention. Okay? Through attention. And you know this. It's why you're hurt when you are sharing something of significance with your husband or your wife, and the other person is obviously not in the room. I mean, their body's there, but their mind is somewhere else. They're not paying attention. You're hurt because you're being left alone in spirit. And so you already know this, that personal presence happens, spiritual presence happens in the form of attention. Okay? The Lord, we're told, the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he watches, he attends to, he pays attention to all his paths. Okay? And what you'll see here is that there's a kind of convergence at this point, because when I pay attention to the fact that the Lord is paying attention to me, that gives me strength, because it counteracts my delusion, this illusion that I create that I'm alone, that allows me to be absorbed in the wrongful desire. But it also does something else. It provides and really cultivates a deep joy in life. God's attention to us when we're living properly, okay, is a source of unspeakable joy and of attendant strength for living. And you think about it this way. There's just another feature of human life. One of the most basic needs that you and I have as persons is the need to be noticed. Okay? The need to be noticed. And we would prefer to be noticed with the joy and appreciation and affection of somebody, of whoever it is that's noticing us. But if you look at human life, the need for being noticed by another person is so deep, so profound, that if I cannot be noticed by others with favor, I may misbehave. I may do things to create anger or hostility, because I prefer to be noticed even with anger and hostility than not to be noticed at all. It goes that deep in us, this actual requirement for life, that as a person I'm noticed by at least somebody else. Maybe not everybody, but by somebody. Here's the beautiful truth that we see in Scripture that underlies and gives strength for doing the right thing, for counteracting temptation. The beautiful truth is this: God notices you. You already have his attention. You don't have to do anything in order to gather it. You don't need to impress him. You don't need to offend him. You don't have to do anything to get his attention. He already notices you and is paying attention. If you respond to his attention with yours, okay, if you notice the fact that he's drawn near, the result, what will follow, will be joy, and with that, all of the moral strength needed for wise living. The Lord is present here and now. That means he's paying attention to you where you're at. In the joy and the strength of that awareness, we can manage our life wisely. We can develop the moral depth perception we need to live well in this world. We can get off the conveyor belt long before we're gripped by silly and shallow and destructive desires. And we can actively enjoy all of the goodness and all of the delight that God created for us, because we're here in his presence, wherever we are. First, we are in the presence. We are noticed by God. And out of that strength, we can live. Grace and peace to you.